50 years. That's how long this land went without a single drop of flowing water. No rivers, no springs, no life. Just cracked earth, white dust, and silence. Farmers had left. Villages had emptied. The soil itself had turned to powder and blown away. If you saw it from above, you'd assume nothing could ever grow there again. Scientists said the damage was permanent. Aid organizations agreed. So did the satellite data. And yet, right now, that same land holds a dense, expanding forest. Rivers that geologists had written off as dead are flowing again, full and clean. Farmers are pulling 3 harvests a year. Here's what makes this strange. Nobody planted a single tree. No seeds were imported. No saplings were trucked in. No expensive reforestation machinery ever touched this ground. The forest appeared on its own. Or at least, that's what it looked like from the outside. The real story is far more calculated and far more surprising, because what these communities discovered wasn't a new technology. It wasn't a government program or a foreign aid breakthrough. It was something that had been buried under their feet the entire time. Something alive, something waiting. And once they understood what it was, they didn't plant a forest. They simply got out of its way. This is the story of 2,900 hectares in Ethiopia, and how one of the most degraded landscapes on Earth quietly came back to life. Ethiopia, 1984. The images that came out of this country that year haunted an entire generation. Skeletal children, cracked earth, empty bowls, a famine that killed over 1 million people in less than 12 months. But the famine wasn't just about drought. It was the end result of something that had been building for over a century. Ethiopia had once been covered in forest across 2/3 of its land. Ancient woodlands, dense canopies, rivers that never ran dry. Then came the axes, slowly at first, then faster, then completely out of control. By the time the famine hit, forest cover had collapsed from 66% to barely 3%. When the trees disappeared, something invisible broke. The soil, no longer held by roots, began to move. Every rainstorm, instead of soaking into the earth, turned into a brown torrent, washing topsoil off the mountains, carrying it down into rivers, and then out to sea, gone forever. Ethiopia was losing 1.5 billion tons of topsoil every single year. The land wasn't just degraded, it was bleeding out. And every year it bled, the people got poorer. And every year they got poorer. They cut more trees to survive. A perfect loop of collapse. By the 1990s, entire river systems had gone dry. Wells that villages had used for generations hit nothing but dust. The Tigray region, once a farming heartland, had become something closer to a canyon of bare rock and sand. International teams arrived with funding, equipment, and ambitious planting programs. They brought hundreds of millions of saplings. They planted them carefully, systematically, at massive scale, until one agronomist decided to dig. His name was Chris Reach, a Dutch land restoration specialist who had spent decades watching reforestation projects fail across Africa. He wasn't new to this. He'd seen the cycle before. Experts arrive, trees get planted, trees die, experts leave. But something about Ethiopia bothered him differently. He kept asking the same question nobody else was asking. Why does bare land still produce occasional green shoots after rainfall? Not planted shoots, random ones, appearing from nowhere. And what he found stopped him cold. Beneath the sand, sometimes just centimeters down, sometimes meters, were stumps. Ancient stumps, massive ones, root systems so deep and so wide they extended 20, sometimes 30 meters into the bedrock below. These trees hadn't died. They had been cut down, grazed down, burned down repeatedly for generations, but the roots had never given up. Every time a shoot appeared above ground, a goat or a cow ate it. Within days, the tree would push another shoot. The animal would eat that too. For decades, sometimes longer, the root system just kept waiting, storing energy, holding moisture, surviving in silence underground. Reach realized something that turned the entire global reforestation model on its head. You don't need to plant a forest here. The forest is already here. It never left. Now here's where it gets unsettling. Those root systems, some of them, were estimated to be over 200 years old. 2 centuries of survival, underground, invisible. All they needed was one thing: for humans to stop destroying every shoot the moment it appeared. It required changing people. For thousands of years, livestock had meant survival in this region. A man's cattle were his savings account, his insurance, his status. You didn't lock them up, you let them roam. That's how it had always worked. So when local officials in Tigray stood before community elders and said, "No more free grazing on restoration land," the room went cold. This wasn't a policy disagreement. It felt like an attack on identity itself. But the elders listened. And then Remarkably, they agreed. What followed was called a social fence. No wire, no walls, no government enforcement teams patrolling the hills. Just an agreement between neighbors. If anyone let their livestock graze on protected land, the entire community would lose everything they had collectively built. That kind of pressure, social, not legal, turned out to be more powerful than any government regulation. Communities divided their landscape into strict zones. Steep mountaintops locked off entirely for forest recovery. Valley floors dedicated to fruit cultivation. And then the real labor began. Men, elders, and young workers moved onto the mountainsides with nothing but hand tools. No machinery, no outside funding for equipment, just picks, shovels, and bare hands. They began cutting terraces into slopes so steep that standing on them required careful footing, building small stone check dams across every gully and channel they could find, digging infiltration pits 1 meter deep by the thousands, then by the tens of thousands. The goal was radical in its simplicity. What happened next, nobody fully predicted, not even the specialists who designed the system. The first sign came quietly. A farmer in Tigray noticed something odd at the base of a dry gully he passed every morning. Not from recent rain. The last rainfall had been weeks ago. He told his neighbors. They came and looked. Nobody had an explanation. Then it happened in another valley, then another. Patches of moisture appearing in places that had been bone dry for decades. Within 2 rainy seasons, something even stranger began. A thin line of water appeared at the base of a hillside in Humbo, moving slowly. Barely a trickle, one that hadn't flowed in living memory. Then a second spring returned, then a third. Wells that farmers had abandoned because they'd hit nothing but dust. Those same wells were now filling from below. Groundwater levels that had sat at 50 meters depth were rising. In some areas, they climbed to within 10 meters of the surface. The underground water system, depleted across centuries of deforestation, was recharging itself. And as the moisture returned to the soil, the ancient root systems responded. Shoots that communities had carefully protected began thickening. Within 3 years, some had grown to full woody trees over 2 meters tall, without a single seed being placed in the ground, without a single sapling being transported from a nursery. The forest was coming back on its own terms, and it was moving faster than anyone had projected. But here's what the satellite images revealed next, something that crossed far beyond Ethiopia's borders and quietly alarmed governments across 3 countries downstream. Ethiopia supplies 85% of the water that flows into the Nile River. Every drop that falls on these highlands eventually moves north, through Sudan, through Egypt, into the Mediterranean. When Ethiopia's watersheds were dying, that flow was becoming erratic. Downstream governments had been quietly modeling worst-case scenarios for years. But as the restored watersheds began holding water instead of shedding it, something shifted. Hydrologists monitoring the river downstream noticed the pattern and traced it back to one source: the hillsides of Tigray and Humbo. Back inside Ethiopia, the transformation had become impossible to ignore. Forest cover that had collapsed to 3% had climbed back above 20%. Farmers who once survived on emergency food aid were now exporting avocado, papaya, and premium Arabica coffee, crops that require stable year-round water, crops that nobody would have risked planting here a decade ago. Household incomes rose by 76%, and then came something nobody had planned for at all. The Humbo Forest Project became the first forestry initiative in Africa to earn United Nations carbon credits, millions of dollars, flowing back into the same communities that had moved 90 million tons of rock with their bare hands. That figure still deserves a moment. 90 million tons, moved without machinery, without foreign equipment, without a single international contractor. The equivalent of 15 Giza pyramids, shifted by hand, by ordinary men across brutal terrain, not for profit, for survival, for their children, for their land. And it worked. A country the world had written off as a permanent aid dependent had quietly become a model that restoration scientists now study from every continent. The lesson isn't complicated. Nature doesn't need to be rebuilt from scratch. It needs to be protected long enough to remember what it was. Ethiopia remembered. If you found this story worth your time, subscribe. There are more of these hidden transformations happening right now, in places the world hasn't noticed yet.